Hi, folks. It's Jeff, and welcome to the Daily Evolver on Wednesday, October 11th, 2017. And today, I wanted to take a look at a story that has really caught the country's attention in the last week, and which really exemplifies an evolutionary move in our culture that I think is worth noting. And this is the sudden and complete ignominious fall of Harvey Weinstein, the famed Hollywood producer, for sexual harassment, and being accused by now, it seems, countless women. And again, from an evolutionary perspective, I think this represents the cracking of some of the, I was going to say the last vestiges of the patriarchy. I'm not sure it's the last vestiges, but it may be the middle of the end of the patriarchy. And let me explain what I mean. And to do that, I want to use evolutionary theory, because I really feel like it helps us to feel into what's going on here. And as integralists, we want to do that. We want to have a subtle body realization of our world and our life and our culture. So here's a stab at that. So evolutionarily speaking, the sort of the dynamics between the sexes, and this started with Darwin's observations, is a balance in ideal circumstances between male aggression and female choice. And evolutionary biologists point out that a population is healthiest when those are both in force. Unfortunately, the male aggression sometimes exceeds the female choice. And this is seen at every level of life, from primates, mammals, birds, fish, even insects. You see the male harassing and intimidating at every level of life. But again, when it's in balance, it's healthy. And you can also see where female choice is very powerful. I mean, I think the classic example is the peacock, where males have to jump through all kinds of hoops to get that female peacock going, and he's got to walk around with these, it would seem, evolutionarily non-adaptive tail feathers, just so he can get a little from time to time. So anyway, so this balance between these two things, and Darwin said that they were both equally important, and it's been pointed out by Ken Wilber and others, David Boyce is writing a book on it, that in modern times, the male aggression in terms of our understanding of Darwin and how we see Darwin has gotten all out of proportion, that female choice is very much an essential part of this engine, this dynamic of evolution. So at any rate, in the human realm, this all continues, and we can feel that, we can feel that animal mind that lives in the body, that hot sexual intelligence that animals feel too. You realize, this is one of the things I talked about last week, where I was so praising this National Geographic book magazine that is on animal intelligence, and how the author had an integral sensibility in that he not only showed how animals can do things that we thought were exclusively human, but that humans also have an animal mind, and that's that strata that we want to be in touch with. And so as we walk up the evolutionary spiral, we start at the archaic, where we're basically living in instinct and small bands and tribes, and as we move into self-consciousness and out of an animal identity that's merged with nature, we're probably part chimp and part bonobo. I think when we have that repertoire that includes both hard and fast and slow and languorous, we're in good territory. And that's been true through history. And so, when we move into the tribal stage, the magenta stage of development, out of archaic, and, things get a little more controlled, and I've been reading a good bit of the history of the Comanches, a particularly interesting tribe in America, Native Americans. And, you know, they pair bonded, they had wives. Fidelity was not particularly prized. Second and third wives would come and go. There was more of a tribal identity than a sense of direct lineage. People didn't worry so much about the genetics of their parents and who was their uncle, and the family lineage was very much secondary to the tribal identity. Now, of course, there was rape of captives, particularly rape and murder of captives, stealing wives, that sort of thing. But that was, you know, just sort of an arising into a self-consciousness that really comes to fruition in the next stage of development, which is the Red Warrior stage, which is egocentric, individualistic. We start caring a lot more about our lineage, who our parents are. We sort of see how that matters. That becomes clear. Society complexifies. And basically what that means is one tribe conquered another and, you know, dominated them. Strata formed in these cultures around brute strength. And this was the way forward. This was the way forward into greater complexity and competence for the human race in general. Thus the saying that evolution is beautiful but not pretty. Because in this Red Warrior society, male dominance did overwhelm female choice because, again, brute strength is the currency of this stage of development. And this is really the beginning of what we see as the patriarchy. Men dominate, women submit, women are protected. And it's, I think, important to point out that women participated in this. This was not experienced by the women as oppression. This was seen by women as how our family, our clan, our tribe was going to be respected. And, you know, men were such stallions. There was not a great deal of self-control prized, you know, for men. And so women literally were happy to be hidden, to be escorted, that sort of thing. And then as you get into later red, where there's sort of a sophisticated red, like ancient Rome, where the culture's still red, you know, traditional values haven't come, family values have not come online yet. But there was more female choice. And you could see, you know, just the flourishing of debauchery that is so fascinating. I remember going to see the exhibit on Pompeii when it came to the Denver Museum, and they had all of these friezes, these mosaics that they got from Pompeii, and they were basically all pornographic. You know, they were, you know, twosomes, threesomes, they were gay, they were straight. It was, you know, they were having a grand old time. And that went on until the next human awakening that, you know, comes out of nowhere somehow. And this is the arising of traditionalism. And of course, that is exemplified by Moses coming down from Mount Sinai with Charlton Heston coming down from Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments. And if you remember in the movie, he walks down and he looks over the landscape, and there are all these people and these women in these kind of 1950s brassieres and bathing suits, and they're all gold, and they're worshiping the golden calf, and they're, you know, debauchery everywhere, except everybody's fully clothed in the movie. But, you know, he shouts to them that he is here to liberate them. You know, I bring you freedom. And that's interesting because he did. He brought them freedom from debauchery, which, you know, those of us who are listening to this who may have engaged in some of that ourselves realize is exhausting and kind of, you know, drains your energy. And so there's this new arising of, you know, you can't go and steal your neighbor's wife. That's the 10 Commandments. You can't take his daughter. You can't take his servant. You can't rape women. And why? Not because I'll kick your ass, not because it victimizes women, but because God said so. It's interesting. You know, it's a consciousness raising. Every stage of development is a consciousness raising that when we look back, we think, where did that come from? But across the planet, in this axial age between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, and Moses 4,000 or whenever it was. No, I'm wrong there. But at any rate, human beings developed a conscience. And that is, you know, just a fascinating thing to just note. But of course, evolution includes and transcends the previous stage, so it includes it. So the patriarchy continued. It was more civilized, if you will, but still men-dominated women, and you know, that was the deal that both men and women, for the most part, took. You'd still have the big guys who would have harems, many wives, free reign to, you know, have many women. That continues to this day with the Miss Universe pageant and our great producer of the Miss Universe pageant, Donald Trump. But at any rate, it's still a lot of rape, a lot of incest. Women are not treated well behind the scenes. And it takes modern society to civilize that further. We'll get to that in a second. But first, I want to note that this domination submission thing is the stuff of great art. It's very juicy. I was reading, I was trying to remember to see if I could find it, but I can't exactly remember. I think it was an opera singer, a female opera singer, who was talking about how she had mixed feelings about playing this role in opera. And it's one of many that have this sort of same theme, where it's the virginal woman who is, you know, by any modern or postmodern view, harassed mercilessly by the leading man until she finally submits after, you know, harassment and force. And then she sort of is in love with him, and it all comes together. And this is a big part of the myth that arises in traditionalism, and still very much a part of literature and so forth. I mean, the modern version of it is a romantic comedy, where they sort of fight and hate each other until somebody gets harassed into submission because they secretly love each other. And isn't that we know that was true all along? So then, that with a good segue into modernity, which, you know, we often talk about how World War II sort of brought in the dawning of postmodernity, you know, sensitivity and so forth. But it also brought on a great mass evolution into modernity for traditionalists. It's the old, how are you going to keep them down in the farm after they've seen Paris? And I lived through that. A lot of us can see that. I could see that in my family, a very traditional family, you know, religious, conservative. But I remember when I was, I think maybe 7, 8 years old, all my aunts and uncles got together and bought my grandfather, their father, a subscription to Playboy magazine. And they renewed it every year. So he always had Playboy magazines. And I remember everybody thought that was funny. And I was actually scandalized by it. You know, I was embarrassed for them. But I'll tell you, when I had a chance to get my hands on one of those Playboys myself, oh, I remember how absolutely thrilling it was. And I couldn't believe that this was this adult world, and you know how kids are with that. And that was a big deal for me. But Hugh Hefner, of course, gets credit, and rightly so, for ushering in a sexual revolution that women benefited from too, in the sense that women were now allowed to enjoy sex. They could be seen voluntarily. They could revel in their own sexuality. We had birth control. We had abortion. We now have recreational sex. And, you know, we were ready. Now, that patriarchy continues in that the women dress up in their little bunny outfits, and they're really seen as objects. And we'll get into a greater awareness of that in a second. But I want to take a minute to share a column that really made an impact on me. It was when Hugh Hefner died, of course, 2 weeks ago, I guess. And Ross Douthat, who is the conservative columnist for the New York Times, and who I think actually has a lot of integral sensibilities, wrote a column about Hugh Hefner. And he's coming from the conservative point of view that really doesn't think that the sexual revolution was such a great idea at all. And the column is titled, "Speaking Ill of Hugh Hefner." And here's just a little bit of what he wrote. He said, "Hugh Hefner, gone to his reward at the age of 91, was a pornographer and chauvinist who got rich on masturbation, consumerism, and the exploitation of women. He aged into a leering grotesque in a captain's hat and died a pack rat in a decaying mansion where porn blared during his pathetic orgies. Hef was the grinning pimp of the sexual revolution, with quaaludes for the ladies and Viagra for himself, a father of smut addiction and eating disorders, abortions, divorce, and syphilis. Now that death has taken him, we should examine our own sins. Liberals should ask why their crusade for freedom and equality found itself with such a captain, and what his legacy says about their cause. Conservatives should ask how their crusade for faith and family and community ended up so Hefnerian itself, with a conservative news network, and here he's talking about Fox, that seems to have been run on Playboy Mansion principles, and a conservative party that just elected a Playboy as our president. You can find these questions being asked, but they are counterpoints and minor themes. That this should be the case, that only prudish Christians from the traditional stage and spoil sport feminists from the postmodern stage are willing to say that the man was obviously wicked and destructive, and itself a reminder that the rot of Hugh Hefner, that Hugh Hefner spread, goes very, very deep. So, you know, as from an integral perspective, we want to find out what's the piece of the truth there. And, you know, we see this sort of sour spot in history that we often talk about in terms of violence and weaponry, where you get modern technology wedded to pre-modern mentality. And that's a little bit about what Playboy kicked off, in the sense that it mass marketed sex in a way that was, again, shocking to my little sensibility as a kid and everybody in the family. But yet, you know, all my uncles had Playboy calendars hanging in their garage, and it was just it's a little bit like what junk food can do, which modernity also brings us. All of a sudden, we have more calories than we can eat. Now we have more sex than we can imagine. We can see naked women everywhere, it has led, as Douthat says, to a sensibility that is arising among a lot of people, especially young people. I see this on Reddit, where I look at these various communities, and you know, men who are faced with impotence in their 20s because they're so saturated with porn that they can't relate to a real woman. And that's really the move that postmodernity once tries to bring back. So, you know, we move from modernity, from this mass consumption and mass production of sex, to this sensibility of postmodernity, where, of course, postmodernity wants to find the victims that have been left out of all of the previous stages. And of course, women are exhibit A. And I always loved this, the explanation of feminism as being the radical notion that women are people too. The radical notion that women are people too. And that is a move beyond Playboy in a sense, because it moves from an I-it relationship, we've talked about regularly, into an I-thou relationship, where I see you not just as an object, not just as something that I can use to satisfy my needs, but I see you as a person who has left-hand quadrants, as a person who has an interiority, and who has a worth that is equal to my own. And at this stage, we become very, very suspicious of domination and submission in general. It's out. It's also put in the shadow, so it thrives in the shadow. But officially, it's out because domination is the curse of humanity. We look at all of history and see that it's one, oppression after the next. And so we seek in postmodernity to fix that. And so we develop rules of conduct and professionalism. Of course, we have the Civil Rights Act and so forth. But in the interiors, particularly in businesses and organizations, we seek to create a climate where women can be safe and fully valued. And for the most part, it's worked. The Justice Department released statistics that show that the rate of sexual violence against women and girls, this was in Huffington Post, sexual violence against women and girls aged 12 or older fell 64% in a decade and has remained stable for 5 years. And that is really astonishing. And again, consciousness raising, we talked about it in the 60s. And that is exactly what it is. Consciousness gets bigger and sees, oh wait, women are people too. Wow. So, but every stage continues to include the strata of the previous stage. So we still have that animal nature, back at domination and submission and aggression and choice. And we still have even in our modern and postmodern society, we still have retrograde pockets of the patriarchy that persist and the traditional domination submission thing. And modernity can be interesting. It could be willfully blind about these things. Modernity can do don't ask, don't tell really well. And so this is a perfect storm. And it turns out that one of the great bastions of the postmodern worldview, Hollywood, was itself hiding a patriarchy that was as abject and overt as the sultans with their harems. And we see these testimonials from these women who, God bless them for coming out and moving the ball. And I was particularly struck by the one recording of him harassing this woman where he's like, come in, only 5 minutes, I won't touch your breast again, blah, blah, blah. And finally he goes to, now you're embarrassing me, he says to her. And then he says, why would you risk our friendship for 5 minutes? And you realize just how powerful that is, and how smarmy. And we could feel our sort of civilized nature just, our stomachs turn at that kind of, manipulation. So, but there it was in full view until last week. And in true Hollywood fashion, they turned the worm in big time. And so, now Harvey is, persona non grata and a villain, and everybody knows him and everybody's piling on. And fair enough, this is the way of evolution. And this is, something, he clearly deserves, even though, we're not allowed to feel sorry for him, but I still do a little bit. Because, boy, he didn't know it was going to hit him. And now they're taking his name off of all of his movies and TV shows and so forth. And that is an overreaction. Oftentimes that happens, and it won't stand. I mean, history will show what he did as an artist. And I thought it was interesting to hear what Helen Mirren had to say, who she worked with him. And she said that he was always a mystery to her, because she wondered how a man who had such a crude personal personality could have such an exquisite and sublime artistic sensibility. And, you know, here we see levels and lines. You know, his artistic line was spiking into genius, and we're the better for it. His personal line down in the gutter, his moral line and his interpersonal line and so forth. So, you know, we can all, you know, at least people my age certainly can look and see how we have lived so much of this spiral in our own lifetime, and how our own consciousness was raised in this lifetime. I mean, I started out in traditionalism, a lot of us did, and went through traditionalism, modernity, postmodernity, now integral, you know, in a good day. And, you know, I can remember, you know, I think about, you know, how women sort of just cooperated with these earlier systems, where we look back now and see that they were obviously being victimized and oppressed. And I think of myself as a young gay teenager in Western Pennsylvania. And I didn't feel oppressed because I had to be in the closet. Maybe I should have, but I wasn't there yet. It was just the way the world was. I adapted. I was a teenager. I was afraid that I might be found out, but I lived with it and didn't question it. And when things got better, as I moved into modernity and moved into, you know, a more modern city and grew up, I was cool with don't ask, don't tell. You know, I lived my life openly, and I got that people didn't want to talk about it or hear about it. And so that was okay until it wasn't. And then as I realized, wait a fucking minute, my love is as good as anybody else's. And if I see one more Meg Ryan, Tom, whatever his name is, movie, Hanks, and about heterosexuals and their love, I'm gonna fucking scream. And I got angry and, you know, victimized, and that's progress. You know, now I can see that instead of be any one of those, and they all sort of live in me, and I, you know, sort of can metabolize them. And that's true of women too. Women my age who I talked to, a friend of mine who was talking about when she was a girl, she's my age, and she grew up in Iowa, that the neighbor guy who was a friend of her parents would grab her in the kitchen when they weren't looking. And a couple times the mother shooed him away, but they didn't ostracize him. They didn't really go out of their way to protect her from him. And she didn't think much of it, except that this is how men are. And so she batted him away and avoided him. And then, you know, she now looks back on that and thinks how outrageous and offensive it was. And that's progress. That's evolution. And, you know, it's attended by a lot of confusion. I think of myself, I still wonder exactly what to do. I had an incident a while back with a professional colleague who I was at a meeting, and, you know, she had gotten a haircut. She looked great. And I was like telling her, oh, you look beautiful. How good you look, whatever. And she didn't really seem to appreciate the compliment, and finally just said, why don't we just turn to the work here today? Oh, okay. So I got that she didn't want to be complimented for her looks. And I don't know if that was a bad day. Later, it seemed like things warmed up, but it was a good communication to me. And, you know, there's a part of me that feels bad about that, but I also see the part of that that is objectifying, and that it's focusing on looks as opposed to why we're actually there, which is to do some work professionally. So I get that. And that's, some consciousness raising for me. So, where is all of this going? I think it's actually going in two directions. On one hand, to a new propriety, and on the other hand, it's moving to a new libertinism. And on the propriety side, let me just read something that from the latest column by Ross Douthat, which is, the 2 weeks ago is on Hefner. This one is called "The Pigs of Liberalism," and it's about Harvey Weinstein. So Ross is really, fired up about this, and he's coming from the conservative, and he talks about that what we need is a new propriety. And here he writes something that I think is worth noting. He says, "Some modest limits on how men and women interact professionally are useful checks on predation. Many liberals were horrified by the revelation that for a time Mike Pence avoided one-on-one meetings with women, not his wife. But one can find the Pence rules too sweeping and still realize that life is easier for women if their male bosses don't feel entitled to see them anywhere, anytime. It would not usher in a theocracy if it were understood that inviting your female subordinate into your hotel room, Weinstein style, crosses a line in a way that a restaurant lunch does not." I like that. That broadens the field where people who want that can feel courageous and entitled and grab it. I think that, it's often pointed out how green has overreached, or postmodernity has overreached with, consent rules and so forth on campuses where sex takes on the flavor of a business contract. And we can all roll our eyes at that. But I'm not so sure that that's altogether a bad thing, in the sense that postmodernity is doing its thing. It's staking out this territory that we all get to benefit from, even if we don't necessarily want to live there ourselves. And I'm not so sure that it's such a bad thing for a young man to have all the sensitivity he needs, and for a young woman to have all the courage she needs to communicate, to get this male aggression, female submission, consent thing, where it's actually distributed, where it's sometimes female aggression and men submitting. And, I think that's what's happening, is that we just communicate more. And I see that on these sex communities on Reddit. They're where, people talk about their problems and, what's up and what they wish their girlfriend or boyfriend would do and all of this stuff. And there's a great re-embracing of our animal natures, where people who like to submit are, kind of clear about it. And it's not this homogenized sort of modern, postmodern thing where everything is equal, but that, the juice of that animal body can be brought online. And I think that as long as we have the ability to control, to assert, to choose, that I think, in the sacred world to come, we're going to be riding each other around like ponies, if we want to. We're going to be chimps and bonobos. And as long as we know what we're doing, that just includes all of it. So those are my thoughts for today on the Harvey Weinstein thing. And thank you for joining me. And if there's any questions or comments, I would be happy to hear them. Corey?
Don't see anyone raising their hands yet, Jeff. We'll see if anyone does. A couple comments of my own. I'm excited, as you are, to watch the sort of continuous unfolding of the deep structure of feminism. And I think what's, the Harvey Weinstein story, I agree with you that it's sort of a good watermark that, it's beginning to saturate. I think where the challenge lies is that there's a deep structure and then there's a surface feature. And I think the deep structure of feminism is sort of just as alive as ever. It continues pushing forward. Meanwhile, the surface features, I think, are a bit of a mess. We're seeing, particularly in the last couple of years, we're seeing a form of weaponized feminism. Just like on the other side of the aisle, we're seeing a sort of weaponized irony, meme culture, troll culture, all of that. And I see these two extremes really pushing against each other and really reinforcing one another. I made an observation a while back that, the left has sort of allowed Tumblr to become its voice, and the right has allowed 4chan to become its voice.
Mm-hmm.
And, meanwhile, 85% of America is completely left out of that conversation. But I think the challenge of the surface features of feminism, particularly the weaponized feminism that we're seeing today, is it's actually pushing more and more young men into what's called red pill culture. It's pushing more and more young men into not a stage 3 embracing of masculinity, but, sort of in relationship with its feminine polarity and all that. It's actually pushing young men back into stage 1, sort of macho, immature masculinity, largely because the weaponized femininity is creating this field of expectation that all men should be stage 2. Now, as you point out, that's not actually how the real world is happening. So this is sort of how the conversation is being held in academia and universities and all that. But you go to Reddit, where people are actually talking about their actual sex lives, and you're starting to see, that level of neutrality is not natural. No one really finds that appealing. And yet that's sort of where I feel like the conversation is stuck in a lot of ways.
Yeah, fair enough. I know what you're talking about. I agree with you in terms of your description of what you just described. I'm not sure that I think that it pushes people into their corners. I think it's just part of the way we fight our way forward.
Sure.
Well,
that's the ugly side of evolution, right? I mean, it's the seeing that deep structure continue to unfold successfully is the beauty of evolution.
Yeah. And also
challenges are the ugly part.
And critiquing the surface structures, as you just did, is actually part of it too.
Yeah, that's right.
So here we are evolving, daily evolving. Corey, man.
Every day. It gets exhausting after a while, Jeff. I got to tell you, all this.
I know. I want a break from evolving. I've evolved. That's what Chuck says to me. He says, I have had all the new perspectives I'm going to take today. So leave me alone. All right. Well, we good?
I think we're good.
Good to go. All right. Thanks, folks. Thanks, Corey. Always a pleasure. And we'll be back here, same time, same station tomorrow.
Sounds good. I'll see you then.
See you then.